It's hardcore history.
This is human history. Pain is pain, love is love, and those are things that creates a connection between you and a person who lived, died, and suffered a long time ago. This is us still. When you are the bad guys, nobody wants to hear that you suffered or what you went through. But these are people that could be us, but because of an accident of birth, a time and a place, they're trapped in the gears of history. My mother-in-law was the one who said, "You could talk about history." I said, "I can't do that." I said, "I'm not qualified." She said, "I didn't know you had to be qualified to tell stories." So we created a show, and it was the very month that iTunes started supporting podcasts, we started. I'm not a broadcaster, I'm a narrowcaster. I appeal to a very specific, small slice of the overall pie. The time when I was a kid in the 1970s is probably the high water mark of American freedom. I don't think you can have a decent political discussion right now in the United States. It goes right to you're a Nazi, you're a communist. That's the thing history would teach you, is that if you have a terrible economic depression where a lot of people are suffering, the longer they suffer, the more you open the door to extremism. What history teaches you, though, is how things got to here. The more extreme the challenge is, the more amazed I am at the human capacity to deal with it.
They say that the human race is doomed, that we have lost touch with our true nature, that the media has corrupted us, and that the planet has no future. I disagree. I believe that humanity is full of hope, and that our salvation lies within each one of us. My name is Brian Rose, and my job is to listen, the oldest method of learning known to man. Each week I seek out individuals that are changing the world, people who are living and thinking in a different way. Their stories will challenge your beliefs, make you question your choices, and perhaps inspire you to change. I never planned on doing any of this, but now I can't stop. Join me on this mission and make humanity something we can all be proud of.
It's time for you to man up, to once and for all tell your mind who the fuck is boss. I need a fucking answer. What's it gonna be? I don't know what it is about this fucking sport, but it attracts people that really need to do deep work on themselves.
I failed in this city. All these bad memories. I never really felt like I gave a fuck about me or my life. I almost killed myself, like...
Think about something that is going to drive you when it really hurts. Some kind of demon you want to fight.
This is not Pussy Man, this is Iron Man. Under pressure reveals true character. What are you gonna do? You're gonna be in Chattanooga, May 20th or what?
Let's face it, Dan Carlin is a legend. His hardcore history has been going since 2005, and I've spent many a night, many a weekend listening to his 4-hour renditions of the Siege of Munster, the Blitz, and Genghis Khan. This man has a true talent for telling historical stories. He's a former video guy and a former radio man, and now he has his own business creating hardcore history and his Common Sense podcast. Dan is political. We've been working to get him on the show for years, and I know you're gonna love this conversation with him. So sit back and enjoy. Inside London Real Studios, we have been busy closing out our Business Accelerator. Next is the Life Accelerator, 18 high performance habits to master your life. So check that all out inside the Academy. And here's a little bit more about it now.
London Real doesn't stop when the conversation ends. You see, that's when we get started. Because everything begins with a thought, and then comes the action. The London Real Academy is our global transformation platform. Here we bring together thousands of students from over 75 countries. Whether you want to build a profitable business from your passion, or learn to speak to inspire, or broadcast yourself with your very own podcast, or accelerate your life to become a high-performance person, we have the online accountability course and personal mentoring program that will make your dream a reality. Join us, and we'll take your life to the next level, together. Our next accelerator course is starting soon.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dan Carlin, the American host of the massively popular Hardcore History and Common Sense podcasts. You are a former television news reporter and radio talk show host who started podcasting in 2005. Hardcore History now has millions of downloads per episode, won numerous awards, and has a cult following worldwide, including me. Your theater of the mind style is part storytelling, part analysis, and makes history enthralling to the masses, keeping people entertained for over 4 hours at a time. Dan, welcome to London Real.
Thank you. It's always interesting to hear those kinds of things. Thank you. It's wild to hear those kind of things, actually. Still sort of surreal.
Yeah, I can imagine, right?
Yeah, in 2005 we were doing this. I mean, there was nothing. I mean, to think that if you could have told me back in 2005 we'd be here today, I wouldn't have even known how to process it.
I want to hear about those early days, but first I got to get your reaction when you come to London. You've been here, I think, a few times in the last few years. I know we tried to hook up. I'm so glad we have
Right.
now. But what, you know, for a guy who lives and breathes history, a lot of it European history, what do you see in this town, or what draws you to this town that, say, the normal person might not see or feel when they get here?
It's hard for me to separate. You know, I was here as a kid for about 4 or 5 months, and it really got into my blood back then, because I was a history nut even back then. And so I have a hard time separating that, you know, my nostalgia and how it feels familiar from the way I would feel if I came here yesterday for the first time. But it is the most interesting historical city I've ever been to. And you know, the world's full of great historical cities, so I don't know why, in my mind, London stands out, but maybe it's because it's so easy for an American to walk around here and explore, but you just get this feeling like you can let me loose here and I can run up and down all the little alleys, where there's a lot of countries that have equal history where I wouldn't feel either as comfortable or as independent and able to do that. But London's one of these places with, like you said, more nooks and crannies, and I mean, you couldn't explore it if you had 15 years.
And is that because it's English speaking, or because the roots of America are kind of here and it feels like maybe an old generation?
You know, it's the English-speaking thing. I don't think you can minimize that, but I feel like the English make it easier, for me anyway. I mean, everybody's got a different experience, but I was in Paris yesterday, and there's just, you know, this sense of, you know, you're never quite sure, you're planning around different things, whereas whenever I've had any problems here, it's so easy. I mean, in a weird way, I feel more at home here than in some U.S. states. So, I mean, it feels as though you're simply in a different part of your own homeland. And that may be the American-British connection, the mother country kind of thing, or not. I would say I got my first history book when I was a kid, and I didn't understand it because I opened it up to the very beginning, right? The beginning of history, and there's guys with powdered wigs. And it didn't make any sense. I got my second history book while I was living here, but it was a history book for English kids. And I opened up the first page, and instead of people with powdered wigs, there was a caveman. And I thought, okay, that's the beginning of history. And so connecting to the mother country kind of thing, American history picks up on top of English history. And so maybe there's that. But for me, the English have always made it easy to explore the backwoods of England. And you know, if you show an enthusiasm for a country and you're able to communicate that enthusiasm to the locals, I've generally found that they're excited to show you. they make it easy to explore all those wonderful little nooks and crannies.
Yeah, there's always this weird kind of love-hate relationship between the Brits and the Yanks. More love, and so like when I first got there, they have names for you like Septic Tank Yank and things like that. But you know, they do have love at the end of it. So they might make fun of us and vice versa, but there is this special relationship that's hard to deny. And maybe it's geopolitical, maybe it's the fact that this is an island and it was always, you know, allying with the U.S. against the continent, or maybe it's the English-speaking thing, but there's something special here.
I do think it's a little bit of, you know, you get a little, I always get a little teased about the politics and all that, but I think 5 minutes after that, as long as you show yourself to be a halfway decent person, I think probably the way they treat each other, if you show yourself to be a halfway decent person, I've always felt pretty embraced. Yeah. I've never felt the septic tank yank thing.
Okay. I was in the city, so maybe that's different. How much of Britain, when you walk around, are you thinking of, say, 1940 era, Churchill, the Blitz and all that? Is that like a big part of what you see when you're here, or the things that you notice as you walk around, or do you notice more?
They have these wonderful, if you've never been to London, folks, they have these wonderful plaques that they put up on the wall to mark historical things. So I was just walking by one today. It said, Winston Churchill lived here between 1883 and 1885. And so there's no way to not get knocked over by that. But for me, I mean, I love Anglo-Saxons. I love Normans. I love the Roman, you know, history, Londinium. I mean, whatever it is. I mean, you could throw me into any one of those eras. There's certain eras I'm not as good at. The Queen Anne era is not really my thing, but it doesn't matter. It's everywhere you turn around here, you're confronted by here's a glass building versus here's a medieval one right across the street. That's the best of both worlds for me. This is everybody's got their own favorite cities, but I don't know how you can't love this one myself.
Why do you come here so often?
I love it.
Okay, and the family loves it too?
Yes, they're addicted. It's a problem I'm going to have for a long time, I'm worried. My grandchildren may grow up here.
And when you're sitting next to someone on the plane and they say, what do you do? What do you tell them?
It's an easier conversation now than it used to be. I used to say in 2006, it's a 40-minute conversation, you know, to say, and the first thing you have to go, well, have you ever heard of podcasting? And it's this, and by the end of the conversation, 40 minutes later, they still don't know what it is. They still don't know what you do, and you've tried your best. I was coming through customs yesterday in Paris, and you kind of get grilled by the British guy at the customs thing. He goes, what do you do? I go, I'm a podcaster. He goes, come again? And so we started well, have you ever heard of, so finally I said journalist. He goes, what kind of journalism? I go, podcasting. And, you know, we were in a big circular feedback loop at that point, but it's a lot easier than it used to be.
But there's still people that don't know what it is.
Oh, sure.
Especially over here.
Oh, really? You think it's different in different
I think we lag 3 or 4 years from the States when it comes to adoption of technology, and especially podcasting for some reason. I do believe that's true. But
I think it's more of I think it's more of an age thing. Okay. You know, when I did talk radio, I started in talk radio when I was about 26. And radio's demographic's quite old, especially talk radio. They were saying that the median age back then was in the mid-50s. And it was always hard for me because it was a little like practicing medicine as a doctor. No one wants to hear some 26-year-old talking politics when you're 20 years older than he is. But now with podcasting, it was the other way for a long time, where all of a sudden, no one under 30 was listening to podcasts. So now, I think since, you know, we started doing this in 2005, that group has grown up. So in my mind, anybody under about 40 or 45 generally know about it, and people older than that, if they do know about it, they're pretty hip, I think, pretty in touch.
Yeah. Tell me about you. You grew up in LA, your parents were in the movie business. What was that like back then?
You know, when you're a kid, it's just your parents. And I mean, I get this with my kids today. I mean, if you were, you know, I was speaking somewhere yesterday, and I'm not famous anywhere except rooms where people deliberately come to see you, right? But then I get the treatment, and my kids are just, you know, they're just shocked. It's just, you know, your idiot father, and these people want to hear you talk. I think. What was the question again? I'm 52 years old. I'm forgetting these things.
That's right. Like LA, growing up LA,
yeah,
both your parents are in the movie business, and that town, you know, back then, what was it like? Did it feel different?
You know, it's different when I think back on it, it's different. So for example, I was walking through a room about a year ago, and my wife was watching I don't watch very much television unless it's a sporting event. And so I'm walking through the room and I just freeze because I hear this voice on the television. That usually happens if it's my mom, because, you know, there's like a nerve that goes off when it's your mother. But
she's an actress.
Yeah,
you do see her
so
on the
you hear her
television.
voice and you just go, but this was another voice. And so I stopped and I looked at the television show, And it was one of those Real Housewives of this or that, and I don't know anything. And I said, who's that lady there? And my wife said, Kim Richards. I said, Kim Richards? Well, my mom had been in a TV series with her when we were kids, and I palled around with her, on the set. I mean, I don't know Kim Richards would remember me, but that voice was in my head. And so when you say those kind of things, you think back and you go, God, I kind of remember that. I don't think about it because it's stuff when you're a kid. But now I think, I'll go to a movie set now and I'll tell my kids, see those mic cables and all these things we used to step over? I used to do that as a kid. And so it actually, in retrospect, as an adult now, I think about it more and it resonates in the way you're talking about more. When you're a kid, everything just seems sort of normal. So it actually just seemed normal.
But it's probably the reason you went into television broadcasting?
No,
maybe?
I don't. I think it's, I think it's a gene. I really do. My great-grandmother was an actress. My kids want to do that.
Did you ever want to act?
For about 5 minutes, but
Or
I got...
do you?
No. and what I was into was, we were doing improv, and I love to do improvisational stuff. I didn't realize the difference between being a working actor, you working actors out there know, and being a guy who stands up and does improv comedy for fun, right? And so the difference, I think I read somewhere an actress who said there was a huge difference between doing this for fun and then realizing your livelihood depended on it, and I never got to that point where my livelihood depended on it, but I could see it in the distance. And I was not gifted. I think if you do these things and you're instantly fantastic, that it pushes you forward. But I find real acting to be more of a struggle and not natural and not fun. I mean, the improvisational stuff was fun. The real acting is, as maybe people don't understand, it's really hard work. And if it doesn't come super naturally to you, I guess I took years of it in school, and it was great training for where I am now, but I never would have been able to connect A to B and said, oh yeah, this will be so helpful down the road when I'm podcasting years from now, But I do think it's a gene. We certainly didn't get the athletic gene or the math gene or, anything like that. So it's nice to have something maybe we're good at.
And what was LA like back then? Was it different?
Better is a good way to put it. It was a good way to put it. There's a couple of websites that I sometimes go to. I was from the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, which is a very specific place. And there, what it was like to grow up as a kid in the 1970s in the San Fernando Valley. And you look at it, it's very nostalgic. But one of the differences between London and Los Angeles is Los Angeles knocks all its buildings down every 15 years and rebuilds them. So if you don't go for a while, you don't even have any landmarks anymore. And where I grew up in the Valley, one of the great things about the Valley, my grandfather actually was involved in building the Valley. And when he used to try to sell homes to the people in Los Angeles, he had to draw on a cocktail napkin how you get over the hill, because no one even knew. It was like big farms and stuff out there. And when I grew up there were big lots, and you'd have one store on one lot. And you go there now, and they've torn that store down and built a strip mall that have 50 stores in that same thing. Well, if you do that street corner after street corner, you become claustrophobic. And so when I go back to my old home area, I mean, it's a little claustrophobic for me because it is so built up and there's so many people and there's so much traffic. And the beaches are still wonderful. I still have lots of friends down there, but it would be a tough place, at least for me now, to go back and try to deal with that without losing my mind.
And that's why you moved out and you're in Oregon.
I actually got a job. I always say I wouldn't have picked Oregon, if you said, where do you want to settle? But it was not a bad place to land. And I met my wife there, and so it turned out to be one of those places where your life just sort of moves you off in that direction. You find yourself there. But when you go back to places like Los Angeles or New York, and you think to yourself, I'm not cut out for this anymore. I've lost my edge. I can't even really drive well in Los Angeles anymore. Out of practice.
Yeah, it's an intense city and very different and spread out. And yeah, that's why I think I never could understand San Diego, because there was.
Speaking of a city that's totally different than when we were kids.
Yeah, and I just could never feel like there was history there. I mean, sure there was, and the missions and
yeah.
stuff, but it wasn't like here. So I'm just drawn.
No, I don't think anything's like here myself.
Yeah, maybe you're right. I'm just always drawn to this city. Talk to me about those early days. I know that you had this vision of what later became podcasting before it. And I know that you were like, okay, I think you foresaw this new media thing coming where individuals would produce content before it became, doable with the Apple platform and podcast.
It's funny that you know that, actually.
I do know a few things. So can you talk about how you saw that coming? And I think you even tried to pitch that to some investors and things back then, because you're not just one of the people that, I was inspired by Rogan to podcast, plain and simple. I was in 2011, which for a lot of people makes me an early guy.
You're a dinosaur.
Yeah, I am, but I'm not compared to you. When did you see this as a kind of a potential way of individuals broadcasting, and what were those early days like, even before you started podcasting?
Well, it's very nice of you to give me all that credit, but I can't take it. I was on the radio, and it's actually a funny story. Being this 26-year-old kid screaming to a bunch of adults who didn't want to hear a 26-year-old kid talk politics to them, I was fighting with the audience all the time. So that was my relationship. I didn't have a bunch of sycophants. I had a bunch of adversaries, and I was screaming and yelling one day about, what are you prepared to do to make positive change? And, fight, get off the air. And there's
fighting with like individuals that come on.
The callers. Yeah, callers.
Okay, right.
And so there's a message waiting for me when I got off the air, and all it said was, if you want to know what I'm prepared to do, call me and meet me for dinner. Okay, so I call, we arrange a meeting. The guy's about my age, but that's all I know. So I go to the restaurant he told me to meet me at, and if you imagine the Dilbert character from the comic strip, but with hair down to his waist, little like John Lennon glasses, and he was a computer programmer, and he's one of the most intelligent men I've ever met in my life, but he's got his own curse. He's one of these people that is too far ahead of the curve to ever make money off of it. So I remember he was writing apps for the Newton, if you remember the Newton, which is like a huge precursor of the iPhone. So, and then he got out of it before the whole thing hit. Well, that's the story of his life, but I was part of that too, because he said, let me tell you what I'm going to do for positive change. I'm going to put your show on the internet. This is 1995, and I said, you're going to what? He said, well, put your show on the internet. I said, how do you do that? He goes, well, I'm going to invent how you do that, and you're going to be the big demo for it. Well, long story short, he was too far ahead of the game again, but then the idea's in your head, right? He educated me about the potential, right? He saw the future and said, why would you even want to be on the air in New York when you could be on the air everywhere? Which is a really interesting line when you're in Eugene, Oregon, right? Yeah. And so then I got together with a group of people long before the dot-com bust, and the idea was, we're going to build a company and sell it, because that's what everybody was doing, right? And all we needed were eyeballs. We needed subscribers. We needed people who were listening. That's my role. Right. So we created a show, and then in 2005, it was the very month that iTunes started supporting podcasts. We started. And because one of the people in the company came to me and said, that show you've been planning for years? He goes, do it now. And he was an Apple guy who had just left Apple. He said, trust me, do it now. Well, you can start something at any time. There's no necessarily deadline date. So we could have waited years and sort of said, we're getting it ready. And he said, start it now. And so we started it. And to be honest, I had a huge advantage at the time, because it was, in 2005, it was like kids in their dorm room, trying to learn how not to spit into the microphone. Well, I wasn't spitting into the microphone by that point. I'd been a professional for you. So
you've been a professional radio guy now for 10 years.
I remember telling my partner, I said, what we're going to do is we're going to, like the Oklahoma land rush, we're going to go in here, we're going to secure our territory, and then when all the big boys come in, we're going to defend it. And then when people like I remember when ESPN started doing podcasts, he came to me and said, is this a bad thing? I said, no, it's a great thing. I said, because they're going to promote podcasting so that you can listen to ESPN. And then we're going to benefit, because the minute you get your first podcast, you become a podcast listener. And the big jumping off point at that was preventing us from growing was people didn't know how to do it. So if your favorite show said, listen to us on the podcast, and you figured out how to do it just for that one reason, okay, well, now you know how to do it. You're going to go see, okay, what other shows are there? So for us, whenever anybody advertised their podcast early on, we figured like they were advertising podcasting. And so we'd already had a little Oklahoma land rush by that point.
And CNN and ESPN came in when? What was that?
Pretty early, if I recall. But there were a few of those. I don't know, but what they were doing at the time, too, it wasn't original content. They looked at it as another platform to distribute the stuff. So you missed our show? Well, you can still hear it, the recorded version. Right. But we benefited. I mean, I remember there'd be you could watch these big jumps in subscribers, and you would always try to figure out, okay, why did those numbers just go up the way they did? And a lot of times they went up because some big player had just jumped in and swelled the audience, who then, after they got their favorite show, started looking for other content, which every now and then might include you.
Right. But this is a different mentality, because back in your old radio days, it would be us versus them,
yes.
kind of. Yeah, and so one thing I noticed when the new media came in, it was like the new attitude. And again, Rogan kind of championed this. He was just like, no, we welcome everyone here.
Joe's a great guy, yeah.
He is a great guy, and even that attitude influenced us over here, and we were never like, we're not fighting against you. It's like, no, you start a podcast too. You start a podcast, you come on mine. Let's all do this.
It's not a zero-sum game. In the old days, if you're
Exactly.
watching one network, you're not watching the other at the same time. I think the original, starting to tape things began to be the difference, videotaping things, because then you could watch this late night show, but it didn't mean you had to miss that late night show. Right. I don't think the people in the old media got that for a while. I think they get it more now, because you can see them. In the old days, we used to have rules which would never mention the competition, but now you'll hear the late night talk show hosts almost saying, oh, did you hear what so-and-so said? Well, you wouldn't have done that back in the day, but it's not a zero-sum game anymore. So once you realize that if I'm on your show, that doesn't take away from my show, you go, well, why am I not going on these shows? And why are you not having them on yours? And yeah, it became a way to share the experience and grow each other's audience. Absolutely. It changed media completely, because that had been something that had been a facet of media, I don't want to say since the beginning, but for a very long time. If you're watching Milton Berle on this channel, you're not watching something else on that channel.
Yeah, like a scarcity mindset.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so it was nice to see that coming in, completely shifting, and we've always adopted it. And yeah, it's part of the medium as far as individuals creating this content. So you were 05, 10 years of radio experience.
At least.
And one of the few radio guys willing to adopt this new technology, because you had thought of this years earlier with this kid that looked like Gilbert and all that.
Well, also, let's be fair. I wasn't on in New York City either with this wonderful,
Another competitive
advantage. I mean, when you're this outsider, which I kind of have been for a long time, going back to punk rock and but when you're an outsider, it's a lot. You don't have as much to risk, right? I mean, if I'm Howard Stern in New York City, you don't want. Podcasting, that's a step down.
Right.
Well, for
You're
me,
being paid $100 million from Sirius FM. Why would you ever?
Yeah, a lot of those guys
free?
got in it really late for just that reason. They didn't need to.
Yeah, which can hurt you in the long, long run, because you're still trying to hold on to this old business model that you might die with.
I know. I think it would have been a lot to expect those people, though.
Yeah.
And some people did, but I think it would have been, you have to be a relatively interesting character to say, I'm on in New York City, but to heck with that. Let's get into this new podcasting thing. So, and people didn't realize that you could use it as a way to supplement your audience for a while, like the ESPN did with the rebroadcasting. But, it became cool and hip after a while. And that was another thing where, you couldn't even explain to people at the cocktail parties what you did for a living. And then all of a sudden it's cool and hip.
Right. Talk to me about the first broadcast, the first few years of hardcore history. Did it take a while to find your voice or how you wanted to do it? Or was it always the way you wanted?
We were doing, and I, sort of still do it really, a political current event show, which was a manifestation of the stuff I did on the radio all those years. And I was having a political conversation or a historical conversation at the dinner table, and my mother-in-law was the one who said, why are you talking about politics when you could talk about this? And I said, I can't talk about history. I said, I was a history major in college, but I don't have a PhD. I'm not a historian. And, we Bachelor of Arts, I have a Bachelor of Arts degree. You're not a historian, and you wouldn't want to try to be one. I told her, I can't do that. I said, I'm not qualified. She said, I didn't know you had to be qualified to tell stories. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, there's a real light bulb goes on over your head. But then that also dictates how you have to do it, right? If it's a storytelling thing, well, then you have to tell stories. You can't sit there and go, let me tell you about the Anglo-Saxons and crop rotation in the 14th century. And, you're not qualified to do that, but you're qualified to say, let me tell you what happened once with, King George V or whatever. And so that dictated how we started, but we absolutely didn't know. I mean, my first hardcore history show was 15 or 16 minutes long. My last hardcore history show was like 6 hours. So somewhere along the line, something happened, and it was the audience.
Confidence thing.
No, it was the audience. I did a show, the first one we ever did that was over 60 minutes, and at the end of the show, I apologized to the audience. I said, "Listen, it's unforgivable." I said, "I apologize for
because you started going and flowing."
Yeah, or whatever it was. It just took too long to tell the story, right? And so I apologized, not for wasting their time, but 60 minutes I thought was a long time. And all these people emailed and said, why are you apologizing? And we have pause buttons. I mean, we don't, and they were the ones who said, take as long as you need. Now, of course, it's a self-selection system, right? You're not hearing from the people that go, God, I can't believe you did an hour, right? But they were the ones, and I don't think anybody wants a 6-hour podcast personally, but they really...
Well, they obviously do.
Yeah, or maybe they're just putting up with me, but
is part of you still somewhat having a hangover from the radio mentality of, first of all, we got to talk about, current events and politics to keep people interested, and we got to keep it short to a certain extent. Did you have to kind of unlearn some of those? Even
I was never
subconscious?
traditional enough for that to sink in.
But still, you did regular radio,
yeah.
so is it maybe hard to get out of some of those habits?
It was the opposite of that. It was more being free. Like, I mean, for me, the greatest thing about podcasting right off the bat was it was like having a creative white space. If you're ever in radio or television, you know this. They have a breakdown, right? So in radio, top of the hour, you have news. Break at 10 minutes. So they had all these, so you get to operate within those parameters. And not just that, you had to assume in radio that people were jumping in and jumping out of the conversation all the time. So you could never go too deep because you'd be losing people. So you'd have to reset things when you come back from break. Here's what we're talking about now. And so you never got below that initial level. So it took a while to realize, wow, we have all this creative white space. We have no rules on breaks. We have we can do anything we want. And we can assume that if you listen to the first 5 minutes, you've listened through to the next 5 minutes. So we don't have to keep talking about level 1 stuff. Now we can take it to level 2 stuff. So the conversations became different, but you have to do it for a while to sort of realize what having this creative white space means for you. So we had been doing the current events political podcast for a while before we started Hardcore History. So when we started Hardcore History, I was excited about the white space. I knew that it was there. I didn't know what to do with it yet. I didn't know how it was going to sound. That first show we ever did was just musings. I mean, I don't think there's any history there. We made the mistake, maybe not a mistake, a logical deduction, that if you're listening, you already know the history. And so all I did was have the kind of conversations you used to have as a history major with your other history majors. So it was something about Alexander versus Hitler. So you stand and go, let me tell you about this combination. Alexander, we assumed you knew them both. So we did a couple of those shows, and I started getting emails from people that said, I love what you're saying, but I have no idea, about these people. Can you give us some more background? So that became the initial thing that lengthened the shows. But it also starts to go into that realm where you're getting out of storytelling now. You're giving historical information. So I had to, and I'm not sure I've ever successfully accomplished this in the right way, but you have to figure out, okay, how do I give you the background information without talking about crop rotation in the 14th century and acting like I have a degree in that? So
you don't want to act like you have a degree, and you don't want to bore people.
No, and listen, there have been several things that have been interesting along this path. One of them is having your assumptions confounded, and one of my assumptions was I was going to get savaged by legitimate historians. And they've been very kind. Now, as someone once told me, you sell a lot of books for us, which is a nice thing. So maybe they're very, but they've been remarkably kind. And I'm hoping it's because we figured out that sweet spot where they know we're not infringing on their territory, and yet at the same time, I always like to say we're appetizing a new generation of people to be interested in history. And we do it a lot more. History used to be, when I was growing up, Churchill-type history, Toynbee-type history, where these grand stories, but also a historian would say today, these grand, inaccurate, bias, all the things. But those are the pageantry things that introduce young people to it in a way that they like it. So I figure if we introduce it to you, you can find out where we were wrong or where we broad brush things and all these kinds of things, and read the good history. We sell the books that we use for the show's research on the website as a way to say, if you liked what you just heard, why don't you go read the original sources we used and really get deeper into it. And there's been a symmetry there that I hope and think works, but I can't claim credit for having sat down in 2005 or 6 and saying, let me tell you what, you stumble along the way and hopefully make these right choices. And I think there's some luck involved and end up here. So the historians have been very kind.
But you are very detail-oriented. And so why did you think they would slate you, the historians?
Because I think maybe I would have. I mean, I think if I'd had the degree...
Who is this guy with a bachelor's degree?
Yeah, and who does he think he is? And, they're bigger people than I am, maybe is a good way to put it. And I think they have a beef. I mean, I think if you say to yourself, well, who is this person to be giving you this information? One guy had an interesting line, which I thought was relevant. He said, I don't have a problem with you, but I have a problem with people that try to do what you do sometimes. Because not everybody approaches it the same way. And yet there's some wonderful history podcasts out there. I mean, Daniele Bolelli's got one, Mike Duncan's got one. I mean, those are great people. And so, I mean, I think that we've opened up the door here in a way that I hope helps historians and history as a genre. I know we're sending lots of kids to college who want to take history as a major. And there's a crisis. I read several books years ago about this crisis of we're killing the next generation of classicists and historians because it's so minutely focused, and we're writing so much for our peers in the other halls of education, and not enough for the people at ground level. But it's hard if you're getting into the very, very disciplined, scientific, peer-reviewed type stuff that they write. It's hard to interest your 10-year-old kid in that. Whereas, if I get up there and talk about knights and flags and battles and all this, which is the stuff I like, you can interest a lot of people who can then go on and take that class on crop rotation in the 14th century later, from somebody who's really good at teaching it.
Yeah, I think we've all had a Dan Carlin moment, and this was mine. It was like a November or a December, and it was super cold outside, and I was on my balcony grill, because I'll grill in any weather.
Me too.
And I have a gas grill.
That's because we're both from the same place. We're paisan.
That was that. Paisans. And so I'm grilling, and I'm listening to one of your podcasts. It might have been you describing the Siege of Munster, maybe. I mean, that's one of my favorites.
Me too.
I
like that
don't know
one.
why that's my favorite, but
because it's bizarre.
It's bizarre, and I never heard this story before. And then you have a way of being able to tell this story that never ends and feels like it goes on for 3 hours in a way where
it does.
Yeah, it does. Because it went on for how many days? And I feel that as well. I feel like I'm there, and it's just this never-ending thing. And it's raining out, and I'm just got this kind of smile on my face that I feel like I'm there, and that you're guiding me through this thing that happened, which makes it more real as opposed to if it was fiction. I don't know. I don't know if men tend to have a harder time of engaging with fiction. I don't know, but when it's something that actually happened, it was like a special moment for me. But how would you describe your style of doing these things?
I have a theory, and we talked earlier about genetics and theater and that kind of stuff. Yeah. But I think that different people organize their worldview and their thought processes, or maybe they're born with a hardwiring that goes a certain way. Some people think about things in a mathematical sense, for example. I think people who gravitate toward history naturally are able to sort of put themselves in that moment, right? In other words, why is talking about names and dates in the past interesting? Well, if you're able to project yourself into that story and feel it a little bit, it's enough of a draw so that you're interested in it. But what about the people who can't do that? And I think if there's anything that I bring to the table, it's the ability to maybe take you with me if you're not normally that way, and say, let me give you an idea of how history majors and people who are born liking this stuff, how we feel about it. And sometimes that's all it takes to open the door to them. They don't need you after that, right? Once you show them that path, and they can start to, and people have said that to me, I listened to your show, but now I've moved on to this book or that book. But I think sometimes that some people can do this naturally, and that makes the history majors, but all they need is a little guidance sometimes to develop the technique where now they can do it themselves. I wish I could do that with some of the subjects I'm not good at, but I think that's maybe what like a guide or an appetizer, like I said earlier, to making the past something that's more like a dramatic movie, or where you can start to feel. I'm very into what it must have been like emotionally to go through a lot of these things. So we do a lot of really dark topics, and people say, are you really just interested in them? Do you like those things? I said, no, I'm amazed at the human capacity of the people in these stories to surmount these challenges and these things that happen to them. And the more extreme the challenge is, the more amazed I am at the human capacity to deal with it. I mean, you look at these war stories that we talk about, and you say to yourself, how did these people not just deal with it at the time, how were they able to cope for the rest of their lives? Yeah. And so that to me is what gets me interested in the story. And we're old enough to have met these kind of people who went through these amazing stories. And you talk to a Holocaust survivor, and you sit there and you go, how do you do it? And I think part of it is an admiration, because you don't think necessarily that you yourself could do that, right?
Yeah.
And so like you mentioned the Munster story. We started the Munster story off, I think it's a long time ago now, with the execution of the people at the center of the story. And we tried to explain how unbelievable the experience must be. I think they tied them to the same stake or something, so that one guy who's about to get the same treatment that the other guy's getting is tied to him while he's getting it. And I thought to myself, God, I remember being a kid and seeing, my sibling get a shot, and I'm about to get that same shot. Okay, well, that's that thing magnified a bazillion times. And so I long ago figured out that you self-select your audience, right? You choose what's interesting to you, and then several shows later, if you've done that, your audience, whatever's left over, are people who like that same stuff. Yeah. And so now I'm at the point where I can just, if I'm interested in it, I know whoever's left listening is interested in it too. And so this this fascination with the extremes of the human experience, and the Munster story is about as extreme as it gets, is kind of what gets me into it. I do think that my mother always thinks my mother's a little, thinks it's a past life thing, and that you went through some of these things once upon a time and you're still hooked to it. But I think it's just the ability to have a sensitivity to not feeling what those people feel, but to have an interest in the fact that they did this and felt this and went through this.
Yeah. And you always try to relate it to present day time, or oftentimes.
Analogies, yeah, we use a lot of analogies.
And you kind of say, well, picture this in this scenario. It would be a lot like this person today doing this and this and that. Is that something that you always did, or you always felt like it was important to make those current references?
That's an interesting angle too, because I think that's dangerous. I mean, I think we're playing with fire with that a little bit, but I don't see any other way to do it. And the reason you're playing with fire is because analogies are inherently not quite right, as we all understand. Yeah. So when you said it's a little like this, that's exactly what it's a little like this. Okay. But those are the things that allow it to be real, because otherwise, if you're talking about the Munster story again, we're talking about the Middle Ages, and there's so many things that are different. The old line that the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. Well, okay, so how do you relate it to something that you can understand? And that's why the analogies come in handy. But I'm very careful with them, because inherently, the one thing, again, about being a history major but not being someone who's a doctor is that those analogies are a great way to have somebody misunderstand the past. And so carefully you try to say to people, imagine this. And that to me is the storytelling element. So when you say, I had a grandfather who was a fantastic storyteller. Maybe that's genetic too, but you have to find ways to make things relatable, and then you have to be careful that you don't go overboard. So yeah, the analogies are really important, I think, but they're a little dangerous.
The Munster Siege. You keep saying we. Who's we when you go to create this piece?
It might be the royal we. It might be.
Okay. And how long does it take from the very start of maybe it catching your eye, or you thinking, you know what, it's about time I tell this story, to where I finally get to pay for it and download it on
It's
iTunes?
free for years.
It's free for years.
We don't put them in the paid archive for years.
Oh, for years. Okay. I wanted to talk about your business model at some point. But all right, so until I download it, what is that length of time, and what happens over that process? And is it fairly consistent?
It's getting longer, isn't it? I'm doing about 2.5 shows a year now, and that's unforgivable.
But that's fine with you, right?
No, we'd make a lot more money if I could get one out a month. I'm not that competent. I have these wonderful tales in my back pocket that I keep, and the Munster story was one, right? You read these stories years ago, and you go, someday I will tell that. And I have some that I keep, like the next one I'm going to do, and we never talk about what they are in advance, but the next one's a back pocket story where you go, okay, people really want to hear this. And then I throw more obscure things in between. It starts with a lot of research, as you might imagine. And some of these stories, we did a big, long series on the First World War. And, it's a little, I always have to leap before I look with these topics a little bit, because by the time you've started the research, if you've decided you screwed up and you made a mistake, it's too late, right? The conveyor belt is moving and you're committed. So you have to sort of roll with the punches. On the First World War one, I forgot, without thinking, that every country in that war has their own version of the history of it. So you can't just read 5 books or 10 books from Britain or the United States. You have to go get a book of Italian history on this, and you have to go get a book from the German point of view. Well, now you're exponentially increasing the amount of reading material, but I always try to show it. This is my view of things. I like to try to have a Rashomon sort of effect on these stories. I always explain it to kids like there's a Gilligan's Island episode where a crime happens, and then for the rest of the episode you get to see how every character in the show saw it differently. Mm-hmm. And that's, I try to point out that, look, history is something that is just like our lives right now, where if you and I look at a political situation, you may view it entirely differently than I do. And I got a letter from one guy, and he was a great letter. He said, I didn't realize that the past wasn't just set in stone and was one way. And he said, I didn't realize that, in the United States we have like a Fox News and an MSNBC, so sort of a right and a left. He goes, I didn't realize that there's the equivalent of a Fox News version of history and an MSNBC version of history, and one might be the only one that survived. So to be able to try to say, how did the First World War look from the German? I always called the First World War the greatest tragedy that ever happened to Germany. If you could turn around, if you're German and you could turn the clock back, and you could avoid that. You avoid the Second World War. So imagine how that must have felt. I'm also fascinated with the people that get caught in the gears of history. So we did a show on the Eastern Front, which one of these great tragedies, Ghosts of the Ostfront, we called it. And one of the angles that was mixed into the show was, that in the American mind at least, this is a conflict between two bad guys, right? Hitler and Stalin. And there was some American generals used to joke that we should just let them fight and kill each other off and they help the side that was losing, right? So that they could do more. But imagine if you're a German soldier, for example, who's forced to fight for the Reich, but your family has been persecuted by the Nazis, so you actually have to go there and fight for them. And you're fighting a Russian soldier who maybe is forced to fight because they've got a pistol at your back, but your family's in a gulag somewhere. These are people that could be us, but because of an accident of birth, a time and a place, they're trapped in the gears of history. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't committed Nazi soldiers fighting for the Reich or committed communist guys fighting for, you know what I'm saying? But in the millions and millions of people who get trapped in these stories, are people that could be anybody that are just wrong time, wrong place, and yet we don't always have a lot of sympathy. The greatest letter, and I mean absolutely by a long margin that I ever got, and I always remember this from the Hardcore History show, was from a German after that Ghost of the Ostfront show.
Written letter or email?
It was an email.
Okay.
And he said he had a grandfather that fought on the Eastern Front. And the one thing, if you talk to combat veterans, it's almost a truism. The closer they were to combat, the less they'll talk to you about it. Yeah. And he said the grandfather never said a word, right? Was in a camp in Russia for years before he came back. And he said he had to take him on a very long car trip. He put him in the car, he said he put the podcast on. He said there was not a word for hours, because it's a long podcast. He said, we got to the destination, I shut the podcast off, and he turned to me and he just started talking. And the difference, he said, was that his grandfather said, when you are the bad guys, nobody wants to hear that you suffered or what you went through, because there's this sense of deserving it. But they're human beings, and it could be us. You were lucky to not be born in that country. That could have happened. If Albert Einstein doesn't get out of Germany, what happens to Albert Einstein? It's an accident of birth, right? So, I mean, and I think that helps touch your soul in a way that creates a connection between you and a person who lived, died, and suffered a long time ago. I mean, we change a lot, and all the world's a stage and all the people merely players, but there are human emotions that are the same. Pain is pain, right? Emotion is emotion, love is love, and those are things that connect us through the eras. And so one of the things I like to bring out are, this is us still. We're wearing different clothes, the sets are different, the circumstances we operate in are different. But you can relate to these people because the same things that make us human. This is human history, right? Yeah. And I think that's what can take a person that didn't realize they were interested in history and help them understand that they were. Appetize them, as we say.
And it makes them understand the present.
It does. Gives them the context. I know a guy who's a person who works on Game of Thrones. And so I always say, we went up there, I took my kids up, he invited us to come and watch them shoot for a little bit. So they're watching one little isolated scene in the middle of the series somewhere, and of course none of us have any idea what's happening. That's how history is. If you can go back and watch all the earlier episodes, well, now it all makes sense. They used to say when I was a kid that history teaches lessons. But if you go and you read the historical debates in the journals that historians have with each other, they debate that question a lot. Do we have lessons? And people who don't understand history always love to say, well, history teaches us, you can't appease dictators or all these kinds of things. History doesn't teach that kind of stuff because the variables are too different every time. I joke, it's like the old line was that it's like stepping into a river. It's the same river, but the water's not the same. So what history kind of teaches you, though, is how things got to here. And that's extremely useful because all of a sudden you understand. And if you can say to me what people are missing out by not understanding history, is we don't understand what's going on because we don't understand how we got here. And so context is the great superpower that history teaches. Math teaches you something important too, but history teaches context.
Context. And so just to finish that question, how long would it take to create that Munster Siege show? 6 months, 9 months, with all of the reading?
When they were less intense, we used to be able to get one out every month and a half.
But you read that many books and digest.
Well, but we didn't back then, and that's really the difference between I don't like the old shows. I tend not to like any of the. It's funny, but
that's natural.
Yeah, I don't like any of the stuff we've done, but I really don't like the old shows. But I don't like them because they don't match the bar where the bar is today. Those were good shows by the standards of 2006, 2007, but the standards were much lower, right? Today's standards are much higher, and they should be. The medium has come of age, as they say. But that means we have to work a lot harder, right? The expectation level's higher. And I don't mind that because I do feel like we're I'm using every brain cell. Does that make sense? Yeah. You know, I'm fascinated by potential. And when you study history, you study these august figures, you think, dang, you know, what's the difference between potential and success? And the guy told me once, he said, potential's a devil. He said, because you could become president of the United States and not have lived up to your potential. It could haunt you, right? But I feel sometimes like when these shows are done, especially the recent ones, they're so intense. And by the end, you're so spent. But I told my wife, I can die happy knowing that we used every brain cell, whatever potential was there, I maximized. And that's satisfying, for me anyway.
And you're proud of these latest episodes?
No, I see all the flaws.
That's natural.
I'm glad you guys like them, but I just see all the flaws.
And how long will it take you to actually record those?
A long time.
7 days, 10 days in the recording booth?
Months.
Months, okay.
I used to be able to go in and do them all in one shot, straight up. But they were, you know...
You do the whole 4-hour piece? Or
they weren't 4 hours, that's
okay,
why.
Yeah,
45
minutes. Yeah.
And then what ended up happening, and I have a person who does all the stuff that I don't do. And he said to me a long time ago, he goes, why? You know, we used to cough. You know, in radio you have a cough button, right? So if you're going to cough, you push this button and it kills the audio. And we started running into a problem because in podcasts you don't have a cough button. So I mean, I would get in there and I would start ranting and raving. Like at the 35-minute mark, I would cough, or there'd be something I said, stop, and we'd start over. And finally he looks at me and goes, why are you starting over? He goes, just stop. He goes, pick up where you left off and we'll cut it and splice it together. And I said, I can't do that. I said, I'll ruin my chops. I'll never be able to go back into, you know, that's again, still, you know, hedging your bets, thinking I'll never be able to go into radio because then I'll never be able to do those long monologues again. So eventually, at a certain point, pretty early on, I thought, I'm not going back into radio. I don't know why. This is a new art form. Who says we have to do it in a stream of, why can't we splice things together? There's no script. So if you're going to do a 4-hour show with no script, there's going to be editing. Yeah. And the funny thing is you do get a little addicted to it because you sit there and go, I didn't like yesterday's version. The energy wasn't right, so we'll redo it. But it's different. It turns out it's funny because if you compare the two, they're nothing alike. No two versions I ever do even sound remotely the same. So, but we do a lot of editing now, and it's several months of reading, note-taking, marking passages in the books that you want to make sure you include, quotes and stuff. Yeah. And then you get in there and you start the process. And some days are better than others. Talk radio is a little dependent on what side of the bed you wake up on in the morning. I did 5 days a week, 3 hours a day. And I used to say I was a pretty good talk show host for 2 of those days. And the problem was I wasn't the other ones, because what side of the bed you wake up
Could I tell or you could tell?
I think everybody could tell.
Yeah, okay.
But the difference is that if I'm crappy that day, you don't have to hear it in the podcast, right? So you are definitely getting the best of me. We could take a mulligan, as they say in golf, if it's a bad energy day or you didn't sleep well, or when we had little kids, if the baby kept you up all night. And my wife would say, the baby never kept you up all night. But you know what I mean. So this is, you create a new art form almost because you have to. Right? You're working your way through the practical dilemmas involved in getting the work done, so you develop workflow things. And so that's kind of how it developed organically. We can't take credit for having thought of any of it.
And you probably do that uniquely. I mean, everyone else has probably their own process.
I think so.
Not many people do actually what you do.
Well, people tell me